The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, "When evening comes, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red.' And in the morning, 'Today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast.' You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be giving it, except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "It's because we didn't bring any bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourselves about not having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees?" Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast. He was telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ.
Thank you very much, Anthony. If you've got a Bible there, it'd be great to keep it open on your knee. I'll try and put the verses up on the screen as well as we look at them together. So what about this? What about you? What about you, Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? We'll have answered lots of questions, won't we, in our lives? Lots of big questions. Who should I marry, perhaps? Should I take this job? Should I move to this house, town, place? Questions about our career paths, questions about our relationships, defining questions about who we are, our family lives, our experience of life. We make life-changing decisions. But what about you, Jesus asked? Who do you say I am? What about that question? What do you make of that question? Where do you rank that on the important questions in life scale? Is that more or less important than your marriage partner? Career path? More or less important about where you live? Who do you say I am, Jesus asked. Because you see, here's the thing on this. If the Bible is right, if the claims that we've been looking at through Matthew's gospel, if the claims about Jesus are true, then logically, when you think about it, there isn't a bigger question that you have to answer, that you and I have to answer. There is no bigger question. No decision you ever make will have a greater capacity to affect your future than that question. What about you, Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? Simply put, that is the biggest question that could be asked of any of us. Simply because if he is who he claims to be, if he did rise from the dead, if he did the things that we've seen reported, then the fact is categorically he is the Son of God. You see, and if he is the Son of God, then what he said can't only be true for the sort of idly curious, can it? Or for intellectual debate, perhaps, over an evening soiree, if that's where you have your intellectual debates. It's not just for churchy types, is it, who like a spot of hymn singing to while away an otherwise idle Sunday morning. If it is true, if he is the Son of God, well then that affects you, affects me. In fact, it has to affect every single person. That's not preacher's rhetoric, that's just logic. But on the other hand, if he is not the Son of God, everything changes. Then it is just something for those who, I don't know, love a bit of ancient history or philosophy or whatever it might be. It is that black and white, friends. It is that black and white when it comes to your answer to the Jesus question. He's either the Son of God or he's not. If he is, that affects you. If he's not, then it doesn't. So, what about you, Jesus asks? Who do you say I am? Well, first we get the religious elite, the answer that they would give. Let's look at that again. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came to Jesus, and what did they do? Tested him. That's a big clue. By asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, when evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left them and went away. Seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? Seems a bit harsh, Jesus. Seems like a reasonable question at face value. A wicked and adulterous generation just for asking for a sign? They want a sign from heaven, presumably something out of the ordinary, something powerful, something conclusive. Nothing every day, not an everyday sign like healing a guy of leprosy, remember that one? Or an everyday sign like the centurion's servant, remember? Healed remotely without him even going near the place. Or then there was the calming of that tornado just by telling it to get lost. I mean, that's a pretty so-so miracle, isn't it? Bringing back the girl who was dead, back to life. What about the walking on water or the feeding of the 5,000? And, we go on, don't we? Half a tin of Hovis, a few pilchards, 4,000 people served. They had enough, remember, last week. Nothing every day like that. No, Jesus. You're going to have to come up with something special. We want a special sign. Jesus isn't being harsh at all, is he? He knows that they're not interested in a sign, are they? This isn't about a sign. They're out to catch him out, to test him. The religious elite, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're not open-minded at all. They've made their mind up. I think that's our first take-home warning. On this Jesus thing, it's possible that you can willfully reject him as God's Christ. I wonder if you thought that you can willfully reject him as God's Christ. If, like these religious elite, you're thinking, I just need something spectacular to persuade me. Can I have something exciting, Jesus? Something that's absolutely conclusive, I can't argue with. Well, I wonder what you think Jesus would say to you. Wouldn't he say, no, you don't? No, you don't. That's not your problem. That's not what you need. What you need is an open mind. What you need is to ditch your willful rejection. You see, these religious guys, there's no problem with popping up after the news, is there, with their little weather map, their little clicker. Did you spot that? Seem to be able to work the weather out. I don't know if they're better than the Met Office, but there you are. But when they see the signs before their eyes predicting thousands of years earlier by their prophets, signs that the kingdom of heaven is dawning, well, then they don't want to see it. They don't want to see it. Jesus isn't being harsh. He's just stating fact, asking for a sign, proof that they're flatly rejecting Jesus. That's what they're doing. They know full well the signs are absolutely blatant. Many say that they're open-minded, don't they? Free thinking, freedom of speech. It's almost the holy grail of our age, isn't it? This freedom idea. Mind not influenced by anything. Very important in our culture, we'd say. Freedoms to think, to say, or to be what we want. But then I wonder, have you noticed that actually we live in an age that immerses us, completely immerses us in the secular agenda, minute by minute? Have you watched a BBC or ITV or Netflix drama recently where there isn't something inserted of our secular agenda? The air we breathe sets a secular agenda, tells us what normal thinking is and what it is not. What is the prevailing thinking? And it's no longer even subtle, is it? A culture repulsed by the idea that we might have some truth, that there is truth and there are lies. Anyone who thinks that the secular world is entirely neutral is utterly mistaken. Anything else, any other view, be very, very wary, we're told. Think something different from the cultural expectation and you'll be vilified for it. I'm sure you know the treatment of J.K. Rowling, the author behind great books just for expressing a simple fact. I wonder if you know actor Chris Pratt of Jurassic World, Guardians of the Galaxy fame. He's talked about his faith. So he's been accused of going to an anti-gay church in California. Twitter posts calling for him to be replaced in Marvel's Guardians series. Here's one Twitter person. Marvel, hear me out. Just replace him. Just for having a view that doesn't fit the secular agenda. The religious elite in Jesus' day willfully reject him because their minds are closed to look at the facts before their very eyes. Would you be surprised to know that there are facts, historically verified facts about Jesus? The signs aren't hidden when it comes to Jesus, but the signs don't fit the Pharisees' agenda. And they don't fit the supposedly neutral stance of our secular thinking. Verse 5, be very careful, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, Jesus said. I wonder if the equivalent today could be careful, be on your guard against the yeast of secularism. Yeast, such a good analogy, isn't it? Yeast spreads right through the dough. It affects the whole loaf, every part of it. And that is Jesus' analogy. And we're in exactly the same situation today. The prevailing thinking of our culture is all pervasive. Every part of our thinking. Your thinking, you may think, no, I have no secular thought in my mind. I can guarantee you and I do. We will be influenced by it. That thinking is definitely not neutral either. These religious elite that are challenging Jesus, they're not free thinkers at all. A secular position is no different today. So if you're with us today and you wouldn't yet call yourself a Christian, how are you making sure that your thinking has the freedom to genuinely look at the claims of Jesus Christ? I read this week on a subject called critical theory. Now, you might not have heard of critical theory, but it's a way of thinking that underpins much of our recent secular agendas. Let me read a bit. It might be tricky to follow because I'm reading something that's meant to be read rather than heard, so I'll do my best to help you hear what's being said. But if you can't follow it, doesn't matter too much. Increasingly in our culture, the individual experience of those deemed to be oppressed settles every argument and overrides objective evidence. Their perception is seen as all important. An oppressed person's feelings cannot be questioned. Feelings are more important than facts. Does that resonate? You think about society? For example, a man cannot give birth, but if you state that simple truth, you may be accused of hate speech. A transgender person may have felt hurt. Our culture is not only hostile to biblical truth, but to the very concepts of truth and reality. Several lies are behind this, which are hardwired into critical theory. It is a fusion of Marxism and postmodernism, and is the ideology behind woke activism and cancel culture. Your daughter may come home from school saying that she is really a boy. Blame critical gender theory. You may get mugged, but because you're not a minority group, your attacker may get a lighter sentence than if you were. That would reflect critical legal theory. You may be the best qualified person applying for a job, but the company has to meet diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion targets. You do not even get an interview. That is the reach of critical race theory. These are the outworkings of just 3 of the various critical theories that have emerged from critical theory. Christians must be equipped to stand against these challenges to biblical truth. There is you can borrow that leaflet if you want, it's from the Christian Institute. See, find yourself thinking that the Bible seems a bit extreme on a thing. Maybe we do need to adopt something of our culture's understanding on this. Maybe we do need to soften our line. Yeast of secularism at work. In a social setting, do you find yourself embarrassed to speak from a biblical perspective? Yeast of secularism at work. I'm going to give you 2 quotes. Listen to them both, and then I'll ask a question at the end. So this first one is actually a quote from General Synod, that is the governing body of the Church of England. This is a quote this week from General Synod. Most of those coming forward for heterosexual weddings in church are living together and having sex. So what was it about homosexual sex, she demanded, that so upset the church? Why are we reacting in such a visceral way? What is it? And now a quote from the Bible, from Romans chapter 1. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Now let me ask you a question. Which did you feel most uncomfortable about as it was read? See, that is the litmus test for how far the yeast has affected you and me. I didn't pick that topic. That was just what General Synod is talking about. We don't always have to be talking about homosexuality, but that's the topic that's being put before us by General Synod. Yesterday I was chatting to David and Linda at the men's breakfast, and David made the point that it's about what we will have as our ultimate authority. He said he might not like a position that God sets out in the Bible. He might not like it. But that's different from therefore rejecting it in favour of a secular perspective. You see, to do that is exactly the yeast of secularism at work. Verse 12. Then they understood that what he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Friends, beware the yeast of secularism. It is destructive. It is lies. I'd love to dwell on this even longer, but there's something much more important and so much more exciting ahead. Because you see, I think Matthew has included this section as a massive contrast with what happens next. These next few verses are absolute dynamite. I'm hoping to see excitement on your faces about the next few verses. Let's look at them. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man," that's referring to himself, "who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." Now, those various merely human options, they're not unflattering ones, are they? To be called one of those prophets, that's not bad. But of course, the ultimate answer, verse 16, eclipses even those. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." See, after the shame of Yeastgate, where they seemed to be a bit slow, didn't they? Just a few verses earlier, what a contrast. Peter has finally worked it out. Peter's finally worked out who Jesus really is. Or has he? Or has he? Did he? Did he work it out? Look at verse 17. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." See, look quickly. Easy to think he's saying, "Well done, Peter, for realizing that's very clever of you. Well done." Read it closely. That is not what Jesus said at all, is it? It's the opposite. Peter didn't think this out for himself. Peter didn't work it out for himself at all. It's not clever, Peter. Well done, is it? What Jesus says is, closer to you, lucky bloke. God has shown this to you. You lucky bloke. God has shown you that I'm the Christ. So that's our second take home. God reveals Jesus to you as the Christ. To understand that Jesus is the Christ is to understand the gospel. It's the truth about Jesus. To grasp this is to enter the kingdom of heaven. And that is the work of God alone in a person's life. So friends, if you're a Christian here this morning, verse 17 is true for you too. It's God who works his saving work out in your life. He did it. It is by God's grace that he reveals Jesus to you as the Christ. So what if you'd say, "Well, that's not yet me. I'm not a Christian." Maybe you wouldn't say that you're yet a Christian. You might ask, "Well, how do I know if God is doing this for me? How do I know? How do I know if God is revealing the true identity of Jesus in my life? How will I know?" Starting to sound like a Whitney song, isn't it? Anyway, how will I know if he's really thinking of me? Anyway, well, if you're finding yourself here, you're finding yourself strangely drawn to things of God, if that's you, that almost certainly will be the work of God in you, beginning that revelation process. Not a few verses back, Peter seemed to have only a partial revelation, all that yeast stuff. Now it's in full. There's clearly a drawing closer to the truth about Jesus. God reveals to you Jesus as the Christ. That's how you'll know. But what Jesus says next, you'll not want to miss. These next two verses, the how come of why you and I are sat here today as All Saints Church. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades," that's hell, "will not overcome it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." I'm equally as confused why it isn't loosen. We never say loosed, do we? But that seems to be how it always gets translated. Well, there is a little pun there on Peter's name. Peter in Greek, Cephas, actually means rock. But that isn't Jesus' point. It goes way beyond nicknames. It's not what he's doing. What does he mean? What does Jesus mean when he says, "I will build my church"? If I asked you, how did the church start? Have a little think in your head. If I asked you, how did the church start? I wonder what you'd say. What might be your answer? Oh, yes, or consult with your wife. Well, I wonder how many would have thought this. Peter proclaims Jesus as the Christ. Jesus says it's the start of the church. Do you see? Literally, the birth of the church, immediately on the heels of a gospel proclamation. The church emerges out of the proclamation of Christ. But then, look what happens next. This is actually slightly beyond our reading, so I'm nicking from whoever's going to be preaching in, I don't know, probably January next year. You'll have forgotten by then. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. That's his reference to the sign of Jonah. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." You've got to wonder, haven't you, if Peter knows whether he's coming or going here. One minute he's the rock on which Jesus is going to build the church. The next minute he's the rock that's tripping Jesus up. Now, I can't imagine how the poor disciples found this roller coaster of being with Jesus. So what has changed? Why one minute Peter's the rock on which the church, Jesus' mission, is built, and then the next minute he's the rock tripping Jesus' mission up? How come? What is going on? Well, look at the difference. When he's proclaiming Jesus, the gospel, the church is built. When he's denying the gospel, saying, no, that's not you're not going to the cross, Jesus. That's not what's going to happen. When he's denying the gospel, the opposite, he's the enemy of the church. It's so scarily black and white, isn't it? In just a few verses. Proclaim Christ, proclaim the gospel, church is built. Deny it, enemy of the church. How is he denying the gospel? Well, Jesus explains what exactly is going to mean for him to be the Christ. Jesus explained the cross to him. He has to die for sins, explains his resurrection. Peter doesn't like it. He's given Jesus a pep talk. Never. It's never going to happen to you. See, the church is only the church when it's proclaiming Christ. When it's denying the gospel, it ceases to be the church. Now, I wonder how many of us are now jumping back to those quotes we looked at earlier. It's the heart of where a church or a denomination goes wrong, isn't it? Loses its moorings in the gospel. And it's catastrophic. So what have we got so far? We've got the church is formed out of the proclamation of Christ, the gospel. But Jesus has more to say on the issue, and we need to get our heads around this binding and loosing business, because it is important. So let's look at it again. And I tell you the rock, and I'll build my church, gates of Hades will not overcome it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, we know what it can't mean. I mean, it can't mean that the work of the church on earth determines what's happening in heaven, can it? It can't mean that. It can't mean that, because that would mean that God's sovereignty is placed under the church. In other words, God's no longer God. So that can't be quite what it is. Now, what I think's been added here is the purpose of the church. This is, if you like, the purpose or the mission statement of the church. When the church proclaims the gospel, people respond to the gospel. It's used by God to draw people into the kingdom of heaven. When the church proclaims the gospel and people reject that gospel, then they're rejected by the kingdom of heaven. Do you see? Binding and loosing. The keys to the kingdom. Verse 19 is describing, if you like, the purpose of the church today. So the church is formed out of the proclamation of Christ, of the gospel, and it's also purposed for the proclamation of Christ. So imagine someone criticised the local church. I wonder if you've heard anyone say this, well, that church down the road, it's all about the gospel. It's always going on about evangelism. Well, let me assure you, it's not that church that's wrong, is it? We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the proclamation of Christ, first on the lips of Peter, and then all those who followed ever since, all that the church has done. You cannot have the church without the proclamation of Christ. So let me just highlight one or two for instances as we finish. One way this clashes with our secular thinking I mentioned earlier, this is just some thoughts I've had. So that whole Chris Pratt issue comes out of this, doesn't it? You'll be aware of the increasing pressure to keep Christianity a private thing, just for those who want to believe it. Sharing our faith is not welcomed. You can't say, I believe this, without offending someone. I heard just recently talking to somebody that puts Gideon's Bibles into hotels and hospitals, and they said they've been removed in case they offend someone. Could be disciplinary action at work. I know someone here who's struggling with that at the moment. Legal action, or in Pratt's case, that social media frenzy. Can you see the problem? With these verses in view, what that is akin to is expecting Novak Djokovic to give up trying to win this afternoon in his 35th, is it? 35th Grand Slam? Or it's like expecting a hospital to close to patients, or a university to stop having students, or a bank with no money, or a car dealership with no cars to sell. It is expecting the church to stop its very purpose, to stop the very thing that brought it into existence and the very reason we exist. When a church caves into that pressure, when it loses its moorings, lets go of its purpose to proclaim Christ, well, then that's catastrophic, isn't it? It's lost its purpose. Well, let's just go back then, where we started, to Jesus' question. What about you? Jesus asked, who do you say I am? That's a picture of a chap called Joshua Bell. He emerged from a subway train and positioned himself just against a wall by a sort of trash can. You can't quite see it. He was a nondescript young man in jeans, long-sleeve T-shirt, as you can see, Washington Nationals baseball cap. And from a small case, he removed a violin, and placing the open case at his feet, he threw a few dollars in, pocket change as seed money, and he began to play. For the next 45 minutes in that DC metro station, Bell played Mozart and Schubert as more than 1,000 people streamed by, mostly hardly taking any notice at all. If they had, they might have recognized Bell as the world-renowned violinist. They might have noted his instrument, a rare Stradivarius worth more than $3 million. Because you see, only 3 days earlier, Bell had sold out Boston Symphony Hall, with ordinary seats going for over $100. See, in the subway, Bell collected about $32 from the 27 who stopped long enough to drop in a donation. What was this all about? It was part of a project by the Washington Post to show that it's possible for us to be so distracted with life that we actually miss the incredible. It's possible for us to be so distracted by life to miss the incredible. Friends, it's possible to make the exact same mistake with Jesus. What about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? How you and I answer that will govern not just our life, but beyond to our eternity. We're going to take a few minutes just to think through that. Maybe you might want to just think about that one statement, that one verse from Jesus. Who do you say I am? We're going to think and pray about that, and then B is going to lead us in a few minutes.